Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Brett Wetzel, who's Senior Director of Applied Knowledge at Breakthrough. And today we're going to talk about unlocking your sustainable future with Scope 3 transportation emissions. Now, although companies are dealing and focusing on a lot of supply chain and transportation related challenges today, whether it's port congestion or tight capacity in the trucking market, many companies still remain focused on corporate sustainability initiatives. And one area that requires more attention is Scope 3 emissions. What are Scope 3 emissions? How do you go about setting targets for their reduction? And what actions are companies taking to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, particularly in transportation? Well, those are the main questions we're going to discuss in today's episode. And it's great to welcome Brett back to the program to share his insights and advice on this topic. So, Brett, welcome back.
Thanks, Adrian. Really excited for the conversation, and definitely love the first one, and always get excited about talking about the emissions and specifically in the logistics sector.
Well, great. Yeah. So, it's hard to believe that, you were on the program in April. It seemed like just yesterday. So obviously a lot has changed between April and today, particularly in supply chain logistics and transportation. But even underneath all that craziness that's happening right now, corporate sustainability remains something that companies continue to talk about. I was just at a conference, my first in-person conference earlier this year, and that was one of the main sessions was around sustainability. So, it's certainly something that, companies aren't ignoring. It's something that they continue to, try to make forward progress on, despite everything else going on. And the last time you were on the program, you briefly talked about, the differences between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, but they want to focus just on the Scope 3, emissions. So maybe as a way to get started and maybe refresh people's memories, what are Scope 3 emissions, and how do supply chain transportation activities contribute to them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I think, you talked about so many things changing in 2021. It has been amazing to see commitments coming forth, and it really has been across all scopes of emissions. And Scope 3 was one that probably didn't get a lot of attention in the past, but we're seeing it now. And Scope 3 is those indirect emissions. So it's been really hard to tackle them because it's not at your facility. It's not the electricity or the purchased electricity into it. It's everything that's indirect, and it includes actually 15 categories. So you can imagine that adds up very, very quickly. And those categories are really revolving around things like your vendors and also your customers, or your end customers, could even be down to the individuals using it. So it starts with purchased goods that you have to make your products, goes into even things like employee commuting and business travel. And at the far end of it, there's the use of your products that you have, but also the way that they're disposed of, or the end of life treatment. So we're talking about a lot of pieces, but I think what's most fascinating is transportation and distribution actually shows up in a lot of areas. There's an upstream component kind of coming to your facilities. There's the downstream component, and there's actually even transportation in Scope 1 if you own a private fleet. So it continues, even though there's so many other categories, I would say transportation pops up more than any of the other ones when we're looking at what's in Scope 3 and what's in the scopes overall.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I had no idea there were like 15 different categories,
Oh, yeah.
into them. But it kind of makes sense. Because when you talk about all this indirect areas, there's so much that's outside your direct control.
Yep.
Everything that's happening at the supplier end of things, and everything that's happening ultimately at the consumer or the customer end of things, and trying to account for all that. So when you look at a company's total greenhouse gas emissions, what percent typically come from Scope 3, emissions, and are companies even able to measure and capture this, today?
That is the all important question right now. And it's really something that we're starting to take a really big look at. And a lot of our companies are too, because this might be a surprising statistic for people that aren't so familiar. But when we looked across all the companies we work with, Scope 3 actually usually averages about 90% of the total emissions. And that's even when we did the work, I'm like, that is bigger than I even thought it was. But it is all of those indirect things. In transportation specifically, what we oftentimes find, and we're mostly dealing with manufacturers and retailers, but almost consistently across the board, it's between 10 and 15% that's attributed to the transportation piece. And, you know, I said there's 15 different categories, and there's also a scope 1 and scope 2. That transportation piece is usually a top 3 when you think about all the scopes and categories. So super interesting because, you know, companies may be doing a bunch of different things, but we consistently see transportation as one of those top emitting sources, whether it's private fleet, or we see a lot more of that in the scope 3 with for-hire carriers and having to use other partners to move your goods.
Well, you know, I didn't think that it would, well, it kind of makes sense that it would be kind of a high number, but 90% sounds, large. And, you know, it just goes to show you, I mean, I mean, you would think that, you know, there's so much work and effort going around the things that you can control, you have direct control over, and that's
Yep.
important. But, you know, that it suggests that that's only 10% of kind of
Oh yeah.
the whole footprint. It's that other 90% that it's probably difficult, you know, more difficult to tackle. And, you know, I think, obviously it's because it's outside your direct control. That's where you require collaboration and partnership and the sharing of data and information across the different partners to truly, number one, get a baseline and understand where you're at. And number two, to actually coordinate activities to help reduce it, right?
Yeah, and you asked, hey, are people able to capture these things today? It definitely has to do with trying to find partners and honestly working with your vendors. I would say for most of the companies that we see, especially the larger ones, they are currently trying to capture all of those scope 3 emissions, but it varies extremely. Even when we're looking at companies doing the same things, sometimes they might not fully be able to capture their upstream or their downstream, or the proportions can vary quite a bit. And I think the biggest challenge, if we actually put on a sustainability professional hat, is you have to try to get your arms around 15 categories in scope 3. So chances are there's a lot of companies that just have to find a default or an average number to use. And you're really just hoping you're capturing all those activities, because the large companies may have different types of systems. They may have way more types of modes or geographies. So it's definitely a journey right now. And the one that when we work with companies, the biggest part is let's get our arms around what's there today, but let's also understand the components of it. So whether it's the efficiencies or the emissions factors, it's really about if we can get to components now, then you can have a better way to improve it when you see, okay, so what isn't working in there, versus I think a lot of times, you know, the best that companies have been able to do as of late is just try to get a size of what they're doing and maybe apply a really general factor that you can't really explain very well.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we talked about it a little bit in the last episode, you know, I think one of the prerequisites, or one of the things that's still a work in progress to help with this effort, is kind of standards, right? You know, to have
Yes.
everyone kind of be measuring the same thing in the same way, or account for it in the same way.
Yep.
So I think that's an important, dimension to it. But, you know, established, like you mentioned, there's a lot of work involved here just to get to that baseline, right? To see
Yep.
where you're at today. But then setting a target for reduction is another, how do you go, what should the right target be? Should we try to reduce it by 10%, 15%, 30%? By what time frame? So how can companies establish a target for greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in transportation? Is there a process for that?
Yeah, it's one that I'm happy to say there's a lot of attention just based on the, you know, how to calculate it. And I think one of the biggest organizations that we see out there, or initiatives that we see, is what's called the Science-Based Target Initiative, or the SBTI. And they actually give really good guidance, and it's a bit of a process, but to understand, you know, how should we be bringing these in? What do we need to account for? And I think what's really interesting when we talk about scope 3 is their guidance is if scope 3 is 40% or more of your total emissions, then it needs to be included in a target. And, you know, I don't know that we've come across any clients that have had less than 40%. So it definitely does put it out there as this is something that needs to be accounted for, and have a goal set towards it. And then through Science-Based Targets Initiative, it's actually aligned to some of the fundamentals of the Paris Climate Accord. So we're seeing then guidance as far as how far should we go with cuts or with emissions reductions. And it could be scope 1 and 2 separate, and then scope 3 has its own goal, or it could be all together. But most times it really has turned sustainability into a different focus, because it is now a longer term ambition. A lot of companies are usually on the 10-year horizon, so goals for 2030. And it's less of the prescriptives to start without knowing where you're going. It's more knowing where you want to go, and it's going to be a challenge. Like, the challenge is how to get there. But so 2030 is usually what we see as the standard for when people are setting targets. And we've seen those range from, 25, 30, up to 50% reductions, which is really significant when you think across all scope threes. And there are even some of those on the leading edge that are hoping to get farther faster. So you'll see a lot of other certifying bodies, a lot of initiatives out there, but I think Science-Based Targets Initiative for us is the one that we see really companies flocking towards. And when we talked in April, I could not have imagined how much growth there has been, even in just companies setting targets, or at least committing to it. I think it's nearly 2,000 companies. That's almost doubled in the last year. And this Science-Based Targets Initiative has been around for over 5 years. So you're seeing like this near exponential growth in companies starting to sign on to it. So it's really important at a corporate level with companies signing up.
Yeah, no, that's great. I hadn't heard of the science-based, target initiative. So that's something I would need to, look more into. But it sounds like there is, again, an organization. There is a methodology or process, to go about, to doing this. I mean, I think that the challenge is, as you said, there's the target setting, and then it's understanding. Okay, I mean, you want to set a target perhaps that's realistic and achievable versus one that's purely aspirational, but you have no way of getting there within the the time frame. So I think that's always the the balancing act you want to try to you try to do there. But once you set that target, then you got to take some actions or start figuring out, okay, where can we start taking some actions to start reaching that goal. I mean, what are some of the actions that companies that you're seeing taking to reduce their scope 3 emissions from transportation?
Yeah, there's a wide range, but the good news is we do start to see some real common themes in there. Some of it honestly starts with things that maybe with sustainability coming up as a new pillar of consideration for transportation, it puts a new lens into how decisions are made. So things like freight consolidation or improving load fill. Those are things that have been considered in the past, but they have a different lens when you think about the sustainability side. I think decisions that we see probably take on a new lens now are things like intermodal conversion, and even down to the carrier partners you work with. Because I think what's been really interesting, while shippers have been flocking towards setting commitments, carriers are actually starting to set their own climate ambitions. So there's starting to be a common language there. And actually, as of April of this last year, all the major Class 1 railways are all signed up on Science-Based Targets Initiative too. So there's this idea of, the collaboration that can exist when you're working with carrier partners and how their efficiencies can be brought in, because your scope 3 emissions as a shipper are either the scope 1 or scope 3 emissions of the carrier. So it's that collaborative piece that works. And I think the other piece too that we see with some options that work today, but what most people are excited about, and we do a good deal of time educating companies on this, are those ideas of energy choice. So things like biodiesel and renewable natural gas work today, but then what is that plan forward for battery electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, or even new technologies like carbon capture? There's some options out there for that, or even autonomous vehicles could actually bring more efficiencies because they, by delivering higher fuel efficiencies. So it's really what can we do today with the technologies and the energies we have, but when can we set up the right plans, and in what parts of the country really does it make the most sense? So those are a lot of the targets that people are looking at. And it's pretty steadfast across the board that some level of those are getting worked into those conversations. And that's where we think it's really important to know, if you know the components of what drive your emissions, you can figure out where and what options work better. So it's not as much of a shot in the dark to say, oh, I think I'll try this technology here. It's more so looking at the data and saying, hey, this is where I'm challenged and where I can get the biggest bang for my buck.
Yeah, good point. You said, I know we talked about it in the last episode, looking at the data. I mean, I think that's where, a key component of this is really to understand, your network, your operations as detailed as possible, and uncovering those opportunities, based on actual real real data that you have versus, just guesses or things of that nature. Like
Right.
I mentioned in my opening comments, right now there's, a lot of discussion around, supply chains and, and this intricate system that we have and all the different parts of it, basically are broken right now, right? Because there's
Yes.
a lot of things that are not synchronized, so on and so forth. I think one of my takeaways is that, as all the stakeholders in this industry kind of look at, okay, what is it that we need to do moving forward to, number one, not only um, heal the current system, but build up, perhaps redesign current networks and current systems to prevent these types of disruptions and delays and so forth moving forward, is to bring the sustainability component into that conversation and, look at it through that lens as well, not just from a what historically has been and remain important, obviously cost and service and risk and things like that, but also have that sustainability component as part of the evaluation and the design consideration as well. So as a way to wrap up and in line with that, I mean, how can transportation teams join that conversation, right? Be part of that conversation and help, their organizations achieve, quantifiable gains and with their sustainability objectives moving forward.
Yeah, I think there's really two ways that we're seeing that come to life. And what I think we've noticed for sure is getting to know who the sustainability professionals are within your organization. Because otherwise, I think what we see a lot of is a shoulder tap comes eventually. And it's, what are you doing or what will you do? But we're seeing a lot more organizations, even with sustainability professionals that have a specific role in procurement or in logistics. And it's all about being there at the start of it. Because I think the last thing anyone wants is one more objective put on them or one more thing that feels like it comes down on high. And it really is, from a transportation perspective, it becomes that other consideration. So, you might not be able to make every sustainable choice possible, but if you're measuring cost and service along with some of those sustainability pieces, that's where we're starting to see a lot of success. And it's also, successful bringing transportation and sustainability together at the beginning and using that same set of data to see it through, because sustainability professionals struggle with the acronyms that we have in transportation. And when you think about it from the transportation side, there's sustainability hasn't been that objective. So the earlier that those teams come together, you start to be able to see, hey, there's some really big things we can do. Maybe some of them don't work now, but being able to have it as a two-way conversation versus all of a sudden having somebody say, well, here's all the things you have to do. We see it as that's the most successful way to go about it. And we're also working to try to say, sustainability reporting is oftentimes an annual component. How do we bring that into a more regular cadence? Because if you make a decision based off of last year's data and you're already, let's say, in October, well, now you've had a whole year where things could have changed, and like that measurement cycle and review cycle, trying to shorten that up is really what we're looking at too. And it's about being on the same page and also trying to get a better idea as things are happening, what's working, or maybe what are the unintended consequences.
Yeah, some great points there. I mean, the last point you talked about making it more of an ongoing process, if you will, versus a once a year process, I think is important. We talk about the importance of real-time data, real-time visibility in other aspects of it. And I think it needs to become here, be true here as well. And I love the, learning to speak each other's language. I mean, I've often talked about, how important it is for supply chain, logistics, transportation professionals to learn to speak the language of the CFO, right? To put what they do in the context of the P&L and L and the balance sheet, because that's what the CFO understands, and vice versa for the CFO to understand the language of transportation and logistics, so that they understand, what some of the constraints might be or some of the industry factors that are impacting the P&L are. And I think it's the same thing here as well, right? So having that transportation,
Exactly.
logistics, supply chain executive know what scope 3 is and understand that language and that terminology from that's just, folks that are in charge of sustainability use all the time. But it's also equally important for sustainability folks to understand transportation, understand the language, as you said, so that the two parties can, collaborate and speak the same language, if you will, moving forward. Brett, I mean, we could easily talk for 2 more hours, and still only scratch the surface on this topic. So certainly a very meaty topic and something that's going to remain on the forefront, for some time to come. So, again, thank you for making the time to be with us today. I'm sure that we'll have another opportunity down the road to touch base again and see where the industry's at. But again, thank you for making the time to share your insights and advice on this topic.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And I'm looking forward to our next connection.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Breakthrough website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Brett, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.